Well, good morning, Unity Church of Overland Park. Good morning. It is a gorgeous morning, isn't it? Yes, it is. So you may have already figured this out, but the title of our talk today is Live Long and Prosper. And I want to start by making a confession. Well, actually, it's really more like an admission. I am a woman of a certain age. And as such, I was a child of the 60s, and as a child of the 60s, I grew up watching a lot of television. In fact, all of that TV viewing is actually what led to my first choice and passion and career of working in film and television. But even if you weren't a child of the 60s, you're probably familiar with a lot of those great shows and characters, if nothing else, through syndication. So for instance, if I said, "Oh, Rob," or, "Oh, Mr. Grant," I mean, you would know, right? That's Mary Tyler Moore, Dick Van Dyke Show. And if I sang, "I'm so glad we had this time to," who is that? Carol Burnett. Yes, you are good. And if I did this, Star Trek. Yes, live long and prosper. So let's practice that right now. I want you to turn to your neighbor, make sure no one's left out, and simply say, "Live long and prosper." Well done. Well done. Excellent. Excellent. And so one of the key ideas that we're going to explore today is, what did it mean to live long and prosper in the Star Trek universe? And what did it mean to the actor who actually created this amazing affirmation? And what does the deeper meaning, what could this deeper meaning actually hold for you in your own life? Now, we're going to take a look at each of these, but first we need to lay a little bit of groundwork with some Star Trek history. And I know we are in sacred territory. Don't send me any emails. So if you are a hardcore Trekkie, and you know who you are, you probably already know a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and that's wonderful. But if you're not, that's okay too, because you don't have to be a Trekkie to understand some of these spiritual principles. Now, with that said, I want to start at the very beginning. And in the beginning, there was Gene Roddenberry, the creator. Gene Roddenberry, known as the Great Bird of the Galaxy, who in 1966 said, "Let there be great sci-fi on television." And thus, new life was breathed into a TV series called Star Trek, known simply today as the original series, or TOS. And so the Star Trek concept that was pitched was a Western in space. And then there was a pilot called The Cage that was made. But then something completely unexpected happened. It was terrible. It was so bad, in fact, that NBC, who paid for it, refused to pick it up, and they totally rejected it. But then something really unusual happened. The network executives still really liked the concept, so they did an unprecedented thing, and they ordered a second pilot to be made. And this one had a lot more action and adventure in it, and it was called Where No Man Has Gone Before. And guess what? They loved it. And so the series was reborn, and they all lived happily ever after. Not really. Believe it or not, even with all of the stratospheric success of Star Trek and all of its multiple spin-offs and its feature films, Star Trek only aired for 3 seasons between 1966 and 1969. Now, remember when I mentioned earlier that you might be aware of some of these older TV shows because of syndication. And syndication is actually how Star Trek got to be born again, so to speak. It gave the series a second life, which ultimately led to its legion of followers, and there are many. And so, from its inception, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek to boldly go where no other television show had gone before, and he did it by doing things that had not been seen on television before. He wanted to create a show, and he did, that could talk about love and war and nature and God and all the things that make up the excitement of the human condition. And because it was under the auspices of make-believe space adventures, the censors let them get away with a lot. And if you saw any of these episodes, you know what I'm talking about. And so Gene Roddenberry wrote stories that dealt with the strange dangers of illusions and the enormous power of imagination and whole worlds that could come just from inside people's heads. But perhaps the most important thing that he did is he created this whole new world with a multiracial cast that was absolutely unparalleled at the time. So the lead characters of the Starship Enterprise were Captain James T. Kirk, his science officer, Mr. Spock, who was half Vulcan with some pointed ears and some raised eyebrows, and of course, Dr. McCoy, who was kind of a futuristic country doctor with a really grumpy bedside manner. And you would hear Dr. McCoy say things like, "Piffle, Jim. I'm a doctor, not a mechanic." There might have been a little rewrite there. But keep in mind that when Star Trek first aired, it was during the Vietnam era and the Cold War and civil rights struggles. And it included characters that were Asian and Russian and Scottish and African American. And of course, I'm referring to Mr. Sulu, Mr. Chekhov, Scotty, and the incomparable Lieutenant Uhura. By the way, did you know that Star Trek holds the distinction of broadcasting the very first interracial kiss? Did you know that? It was between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, and all I can say is that people are still talking about it because it had such a great groundbreaking impact. Now, speaking of history-making moments, a few weeks back I was watching the documentary Trek Nation. And Nichelle Nichols, the actress who actually starred as Lieutenant Uhura, tells a very compelling story about her role. And it's really quite profound, so I want to share it with you. Here's what she said. "I told Gene after the first season that I would not be returning to the show, that I wanted to return to my first love, which is musical theater. But I didn't know that meeting a Star Trek fan would change my life. I was told that a fan wanted to meet me, and when I turned and looked into the face of Dr. Martin Luther King, I was breathless. And he said, 'Yes, I'm a Trekker. I'm a Star Trek fan.' And he told me that Star Trek was one of the few shows that he and Coretta allowed the children to watch. And I thanked him, and I told him that I was leaving the show. Well, all the smile came off of his face, and he said, 'You can't do that.' He said, 'Don't you understand that for the first time, we are seen as we should be? You don't have a black role, you have an equal role.'" It's pretty significant, right? So you can imagine the powerful impression that this had on Nichelle Nichols. And so when she went into work the following Monday, she explained to Gene Roddenberry what had happened over the weekend, and she said, "I will definitely be staying on the show." And thank goodness she did, because this is one of the greatest examples of how Star Trek broke out all kinds of cultural boundaries and prejudices. I mean, after all, not only was Nichelle Nichols African American, but in 1966, she was an African American woman on television in the role of an officer. But Lieutenant Uhura's character in the original series wasn't the only one offering up something different for viewers to look at on the small screen. Case in point, the late Leonard Nimoy's iconic portrayal of Mr. Spock. And while he may be gone from this earth, his artistry will live on in our hearts forever because Leonard Nimoy's talents extended way beyond television. In other words, he definitely lived long and prospered. For instance, he was an internationally well-known writer, singer. He was an accomplished fine arts photographer, and he was a very successful director. In fact, he actually directed 2 of the Star Trek feature films, and you may not know this, but he also directed the 1980s blockbuster 3 Men and a Baby. It's true. Now, you might be tempted to assume that he was a lot like the fictional version of the brilliant, rational, and unemotional Mr. Spock, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Those who knew him well said that Leonard Nimoy was a true artist and a philanthropist. They say that he was warm and funny and very charming. So knowing all of this about him makes it even easier to understand why he received not 1 but 3 consecutive Emmy nominations for his work on Star Trek. So you see, Leonard Nimoy had a gift for infusing unique ideas into the role of Mr. Spock that were actually relevant to his own life experiences. And one of these ideas was the Vulcan hand salute. Actually, there's a really wonderful little story behind this, and I want to share it with you too. In a famous episode titled Amok Time, Mr. Spock has to go back to Vulcan to fulfill a prearranged marital agreement from many years prior. But since it's the first time in the series that we see Mr. Spock with other Vulcans in his own planet, Leonard Nimoy wanted to create a ritual that the Vulcans would have in order to greet each other. And so he remembered this really powerful experience that he had as a young boy when he saw a priestly blessing being performed by the rabbis in his synagogue. And they were using the shape of the letter Shin. Now, this is from the Hebrew alphabet, and Shin is the first letter in the word Shaddai, which means God. And it's also the first letter in the word Shalom, which means peace. Well, Leonard Nimoy said that this service was magical and mystical and very theatrical, and it touched him on a really deep level. So he suggested to the director that when Vulcans meet, that they would greet each other by using this hand sign and say, "Live long and prosper." And what's really interesting is that the Hebrew blessing that this comes from, it might sound a little bit familiar to you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Isn't that beautiful? It comes from Numbers in the Hebrew scriptures. And so this is how Mr. Spock came to embody some of Leonard Nimoy's mystical Jewish roots. I think in a way, Spock became a little bit Jewish, and perhaps Leonard Nimoy became a little bit Vulcan. And the funny thing is, and he's quoted as saying this, that when viewers all around the world were doing this, they had no idea that they were actually blessing each other. So, now that we all know that it's a blessing, let's do it again. So turn to your neighbor and know that you are blessing each other and say, "Live long and prosper." Excellent. Hey, can I get an amen on that? Live long and prosper? Amen. That's right. That's called a rewrite. Okay. So now that we have looked at what it means to live long and prosper in the Star Trek universe and what it meant to Leonard Nimoy, the actor who actually created this wonderful affirmation, let's take a closer look at how you might apply some of these principles to your own life. Now, when I think of the word prosper, I think of all the prosperity teachings that we have available to us. And even just within the unity movement, there are a few standouts, I think, like Catherine Ponder and Edwin Gaines, who was here last summer. And of course, unity co-founder Charles Fillmore, who actually wrote a book and titled it Prosperity. And all of these are really terrific. They're great books. But for some reason, I always come back to Eric Butterworth's Spiritual Economics. And I know that you guys are very familiar with that because you worked with it in your fall faith last year. And I mention this because I think one of our greatest prosperity teachings actually comes from Eric Butterworth. It's simple, it's straightforward, and I even think that Mr. Spock would agree that it is flawlessly logical. Here's what he wrote. God can do no more for you than God can do through you. God can do no more for you than God can do through you. And what he means by this is that God can only help you to the degree that you allow your understanding of abundance to flow through your thoughts and flow through your faith and flow through your vision of your life. Yeah. And so the foundation of realizing what it means to live long and prosper comes down to your own awareness, to your own consciousness, that you are surrounded by infinite possibilities of prosperity. You know, it's kind of like the air that surrounds you. You have to breathe it in to actually get it. Now, trust me, I know that this can sound way too general and maybe a little bit airy-fairy or a little bit woo-woo, so I decided to ask the longest living, wisest person that I know and ask her what her take is on this. Well, this person happens to be my grandmother, Dynamo Doris, who turned 105 last December. Yeah. And she still lives at home. I hope I have some of those designer jeans. Now, so I asked her, I said, now, Ma, what does it mean to you to live long and prosper? And she said, well, it's better than the alternative. But don't let her sense of humor fool you. Dynamo Doris has lived long and prospered even though she eats more sugar, more butter, more salt, more bacon, can you tell she's a Southern gal, than anybody that I have ever known. But here's the thing, she doesn't torment herself over it. You know, she enjoys life. And as a nurse by training, she has lived a very healthy life. So that said, I'm sure you can imagine anyone who has lived long and prospered has gone through a few things in life, right? You know, there's always that unpredictable element. And if that unpredictable element is something to celebrate, you know, like maybe you got an unexpected check in the mail, well, then it's easy to rejoice in that. But if that unpredictable element is a serious challenge, then singing the Hallelujah chorus is probably not what you're going to feel like doing. And you know the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? I mean, could be an unexpected breakup in a relationship or an unexpected medical diagnosis or maybe a layoff from work or maybe an unexpected loss of a loved one. And that's what happened in my life. So a few years ago, in the middle of an otherwise completely normal and lovely day, I received the call that changed everything. And if you've ever received one of these phone calls, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Well, on this occasion, I got a call that my big brother, my only sibling, my brother Sam, who I loved very much, had died. It was unexpected, it came without warning, and it was heartbreaking for my whole family, especially his children. And it immediately put me in this emotional space that I had never been before. And I instantly felt like an alien, in my own life. And I had to navigate this deep, uncharted territory with some really intense challenges and changes. Can you relate? Is there anyone here today who has ever, just out of nowhere, had to deal with a seemingly impossible situation? Raise your hand. Look around the room. Yeah, you're not alone. You're not alone. Well, last Sunday, Reverend Bob and Reverend Brandon and Jan Chapman did an excellent job. Didn't they? Yes. They did an excellent job of reminding us how important the power of love and the power of faith is in our lives. And so it got me thinking about what Charles Fillmore wrote about faith and love. Well, Mr. Fillmore said, love is the great harmonizer and healer, that it binds together the whole human family. And he said that faith is more than just believing, It's a deep inner knowing that you know that you know that you know, that you have the spiritual assurance within you to do anything that seems impossible. In other words, you can spiritually go where you've never been before with the assurance that what you seek is already yours because God energy is in you every step of the way. In a metaphysical sense, the crew of the Enterprise showed us each week how to address seemingly impossible situations, right? And they did it in a 1-hour time slot, which is kind of amazing. And it made no difference to them whether they were being attacked by Romulans or if their bodies had been invaded by some kind of life-threatening virus, or even if their ship had been taken over by some really innocent-looking little, critters that turned out to be extremely dangerous. There was trouble with tribbles. Do you remember that one? Yeah. But no matter what, somehow, some way, a way was made. Somehow, some way, a way was made. And there was always hope in the face of adversity, and they did it together. You see, I think the Star Trek Enterprise crew is very much like a spiritual community. I mean, after all, you don't have to look very far to see how much they loved each other, how they lifted each other up in a time of challenge, and how they had faith in each other. And isn't that what great spiritual communities do? Yeah, they love each other, lift each other up, and have faith in each other. Like Unity Church of Overland Park. And so I want to share a few final thoughts with you about our beloved Mr. Spock. As we know, he was half Vulcan and half human. And while this contrast certainly provided great fodder for some wonderful storytelling, it was his Vulcan side, his ability to be so logical and analytical, that actually entertained most of us. But I think the most important, valuable thing from looking at him from a spiritual perspective, what was a great spiritual lesson in Mr. Spock, is when his Vulcan nature actually became very vulnerable. And I say this because if you're in a really challenging situation, trying to figure it out with your rational mind can be a very limited viewpoint. And just because you don't know the how doesn't mean that there isn't an ocean of possibilities just waiting for you to go where you've never been before so that you can discover them. So I ask you to keep in mind that Albert Einstein, one of the greatest scientists of all time, said, logic will get you from A to Z, but imagination will get you everywhere. And so I encourage you to be open to the possibilities. And while you're trying to figure it out and get it all done, make sure that you leave room for God. Leave room for the universe to conspire to support you in your good. In other words, you want to tap into your God mind, not just your logical mind. Why? Because you never know, like with Gene Roddenberry, that you're going to get an unprecedented second chance to do what you love in life, and it's going to turn into one of the most successful film and television franchises in the modern history, right? And because you never know when that perfect person is going to show up at that pivotal moment in your life, like Martin Luther King did for Nichelle Nichols, and say to you, don't quit. Don't give up. And you never know when something you saw as a child, as Leonard Nimoy did, is going to develop into a simple greeting that becomes so powerful, even 50 years later, it still inspires the world to bless each other. And so I leave you with this, Unity Church of Overland Park. Live long and prosper. Live long and prosper, my friends. God bless you.